Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Mellie Macker. Mellie, could you introduce yourself?
Hey, I'm Mellie Macker. I'm on Twitter at Epona West. That's EPONAWEST. And I'm just a freelance writer, and I live in Wyoming.
Thank you for coming on today. In my mind, you're the ghost wife, because that's
right.
Been your display name for a long time. So the origin of this conversation is there's been a lot of talk in the past couple of weeks about cancel culture and whether it is one of the great scourges of our time, or perhaps maybe doesn't even exist in the first place. So I put out and I'm kind of ambivalent about what I feel about this, and I asked on Twitter if anyone was interested in talking to me about it, who had more sure feelings about it, and you volunteered. So thanks for volunteering for this conversation. And
sure.
And so I guess just the slight background, I guess, is it seems to me that the reason this we've been hearing about cancel culture or call out culture for a couple of years, and it flames up and down as various instances pop up or whatever. And I think the one that set off this latest round was this guy who was hired by SNL, whose name is Shane Gillis. Is that right? Sean Gillis?
Yeah, it's Shane Gillis.
Shane Gillis. And so the SNL announces 3 new hires. One was a woman I was not familiar with. One was the comedian Bowen Yang, who I know a little bit about and is a podcast host as well. So he is Asian American and he is gay. And then this guy Gillis, who I think most people hadn't heard of before, and is a stand-up comedian and a white guy. And very quickly, people started circulating some old podcast interviews or stand-up routines he had done that had racial slurs and stereotypical jokes. And so people started saying, particularly racial jokes or racial slurs against Asians. And so there was this weird irony of SNL hiring its first Asian American cast member, along with a guy who was using slurs for Asian Americans. And then within a week or less, SNL announced that they were rescinding, the offer of employment, and Mr. Gillis will not be a cast member on Saturday Night Live. So this was, I think, one of the semi-rare instances where there was a very quick cancellation. This guy lost his potential job
right,
because of it, and so that sparked hand wringing and celebrations and all sorts of stuff. And an article by our friend and former guest on this show, Osita Wanevu, in the New Republic, that maybe we'll discuss about cancel culture. Okay, so what do you think about all this, or about cancel culture in general?
Well, one of the reasons that I was so quick to be I would totally love to come on your podcast and talk about cancel culture is because last Monday, I was in an airport and I saw a tweet and I quote tweeted it with something, and I was angry about this tweet, and it was from another side of Twitter that I'm not usually engaged with, and because the phrasing in my tweet was hostile, and because the person that I quote tweeted had 25,000 followers, I suddenly had for 8 hours, I got off a plane and drove from Colorado to Wyoming. And over this entire span of time, I just had tons of people yelling at me and, not really responding to sense so much, but it was these people are so distant from me that it didn't really actually have very much of an impact on me other than in real time. But it got me thinking this is sort of the base level, the most primitive form of cancel culture, right? When people just get mad at strangers on the internet and they press the button that says cancel. So and then they get madder when the button doesn't work because they get, for a lot of other things, mostly comedians. It's usually comedians that have to talk about cancel culture, and it's because it's their job to say things out loud. And so there are more things to cancel them for than, say, a doctor, Like, doctors usually aren't saying racist things out loud. They just get to be doctors in private. And, like, what the elements of actual cancellation are, what makes cancellation a thing. And then I got really into my head about it. And so when you posted that, I was like, I want to talk about this. Like, I have a lot of ideas. And I think that it's, like I said to you, it's both real and it's fake. And the things that make it real are the power dynamics behind it, and the material ramifications of the actual cancellation itself, right? Those are, like, the only two things that really matter. So when people yell at me on the internet and try to, they press the cancel button, and it doesn't work, the reason that it's not working is because they don't have power over me to affect my material position, right? Because
as a freelance journalist, you don't have a boss.
I don't have a bot. I mean, like, I'm working on a project right now. They could hypothetically contact her, but like they wouldn't. I don't, like, put out there, like, who I write for, and it's a publication that's behind a paywall, so, like, nobody's going to see it. And I'm not writing anything that has to do with the things that I'm saying on the internet. So, like, the leverage that regular people have, like, in a group over my material life doesn't exist.
Right.
But it does in other cases. And I think that Shane Gillis and then also, like, later last week, a tweet surfaced from Megan Amram. Did you see that?
No, I didn't. So Megan Amram is a very popular, funny person on Twitter, and she has written for, she used to write for The Good Place, which wrapped up recently, and makes funny videos and is generally celebrated by many people online.
Yeah. So somebody dug up a tweet from 2011 from her that was, right around the same time that Shane Gillis was saying a lot of his offensive stuff. Like, he continued. She just posted this one thing, as far as I could tell. And, it was racist against Asian Americans, and it was also extremely ableist against people with Down syndrome. So, like, you can see where the tweet was going from that description. And I actually don't know what the fallout from that really looked like. Most people just said, like, this is a bad look, et cetera, et cetera. But, like, they didn't get really mad. From what I could tell, there wasn't the sort of backlash from people finding this tweet that there was for this dude who got hired on SNL. And I think that, like, that's interesting to me because they're very similar people with similar jobs where, like, they both do comedy. They both, like, are higher up writing for NBC specifically. Like,
right.
And
yeah, I think I could come up with a couple differences between them if you want to go off onto that tangent.
Yeah, Megan Amram is good and probably tweeted that and then didn't delete it because she's, like, didn't consider it. Like, maybe she forgot that she tweeted it, but, like, I don't know. There's a certain amount of, like, forgivableness because she's nice. I think that's an important part of it. Like close to universally beloved among a certain sector of, like, people who like comedy. She seems like a nice person. She's made these very self-deprecating, like, fake TV shows that was trying to, she had this campaign to, like, win Megan an Emmy. And so she made a short, online series called, like, An Emmy for Megan, in which she was just, like, making fun of herself. And, so she's a very talented person and talented at Twitter. So everyone likes her. She also went to Harvard, and she's a woman. And Gillis, kind of, like, he's not in that world. I guess he was, like, just a stand-up comedian trying to make it and traveling around and doing gigs on kind of a, medium to low level. And that's how he got the SNL audition. And he must be good at, doing imitations or something, because that's mostly what the people on SNL do, is they imitate celebrities. And he didn't have, and I'm guessing also, like, he didn't have any sort of powerful friends or institutional support that would have stood up for him and been like, oh, this, okay, he made some mistakes. He's basically a good guy. Give him a chance. I mean, I think that, like, just reading a bunch of the fallout from it, like, it seems like the reason that it didn't continue and that, like, they just, like, Gillis just sort of dropped it and walked away. It was like he understood implicitly that he was going to be fine without a job on SNL. And so most of the argument that's been taking place in the public sphere has been about whether or not this should have happened, not so much that his life is ruined, which is a few steps down from, like, the alarm that usually comes along with this sort of thing. And also there was that statement that came from, I can't remember if it just came from the writer's room or if it came from Lorne Michaels, but, like, they hired Shane Gillis specifically to attempt to attract the demographic of MAGA baby boomers. Like, they wanted those people to be the ones who were... They wanted to pick up more of an audience from conservative people, and so they thought that hiring him would be a good way to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and SNL is, I mean, it's such a weird cultural institution. It's, you know, it's been around since the late 70s and run by the same person. Like, how many, like, I don't think there's a single other thing you could say that has been around since like 1977 and has had one person running it. It's seen as, like, a very important comedy institution, despite the fact that it's very rarely funny. But it also,
it's bad.
it launches the careers of, you know, dozens of very talented, successful people. Bill Hader won an Emmy last night. You know, he was on that show for a long time, playing stupid characters like Stefan, the like kind of gay guy who went to clubs and giggled. But apparently, he's a very talented actor and. He created this show Barry that I haven't seen, but everyone loves. So
yeah, everybody says.
And Tina Fey. I'm not going to say she's universally beloved, but you have to say she's a very talented person. But at the same time, the show itself is pretty mediocre, and I stopped watching. It's for teenagers. Like that's who it's aimed at.
It's for teenagers, but also, like, it's for my parents. Like, this is the weirdest part about it is that, like, my parents are, like, my dad was a conservative columnist for, like, 25 years. Like, my mom is just a weird Arizona libertarian. And they watch Saturday Night Live consistently and have for decades. And it's the strangest thing to me because they hate it. Like, nobody likes it. Yeah, they just want to see the ways that they're going to get mad. I assume there's some people out there who genuinely do enjoy it, and I enjoyed it when I watched it, in the 90s when I was a teenage boy, because I think that's kind of the demographic. And so at one time it's kind of this bizarre cultural relic that is mostly crap. At the same time, like, it's had a major effect on American culture and launched the careers of, there was this, Adam Sandler has this new kind of comedy drama thing that the trailer dropped today, and people on Twitter were going nuts for it. Adam Sandler was playing a Boy Scout who was being molested, in the early 90s on SNL. So it's just very, very, very strange. And I think, like, I was joking on Twitter that, Lorne Michaels has to hire one nondescript white man every year as part of his contract with the devil that enables him to live for 1,000 years, because they bring in these white guys who are just kind of interchangeable, and sometimes they're talented, sometimes they're kind of anonymous and they'll fade away. And the Gillis kind of seemed like that he was that guy for this year. It's like, we have a woman, we have an Asian gay guy, we need to bring in a straight white man, or else it's like it still wants to be kind of a national program, even though obviously most people who work there are, like, New York liberals, I would guess. Although maybe since they're also rich, maybe they're more they have conservative leanings as well. You have to wonder, like, what they saw in this dude that was, like, going to appeal to baby boomer conservatives, right? Like, was it that he makes, like, racist, edgy jokes, or is it that he's a nondescript white guy, and was funny enough to sort of be on Saturday Night Live?
And there's also, just a weird side note, there's a sizable number of people who came out of SNL in the 80s in particular who turned into, like, conservative pundit types or conservative activists. Dennis Miller, John Lovitz, the woman whose is her name Valerie something? I can't remember her name right now, but one of the main women in the 80s on the show is like a very vocal pro-Trump person. And, Rob Schneider spoke out in defense of Gillis.
Right, yeah. He always has to talk, and then I get reminded that Rob Schneider is a person, like when all this stuff always happens.
Yeah,
it's great.
It's not like it's always been this bastion of like liberalism or anything.
No. The only thing that matters about it is that it is like, it's something concrete that has endured for a really long time, that is like, you can point to that and be like, that's a major part of American culture. That's an institution of American culture. And like, in the way, if whatever it's doing is sort of like a harbinger of like the most flattened out, like watered down version of a coagulated American culture that there could possibly be. You're just taking all of the opinions, you're smashing them together, you're rolling them out like a pie dough, and then you're pouring water on top of it. And that's what American culture is through the lens of SNL. And like that some people might not see that as like this is, the liberal progressive version of things, but conservatives do. And that's because conservatives are constantly howling and wounded about how they don't actually have control over the cultural narrative of the United States. And they really want that. That's the thing that they want the most. And so like anytime anything happens in terms of SNL, that's something that they desperately want. They want it to be conservative. They want to make fun of liberals and not the president only. Like, they want it to be jokes about safe spaces and, all of these things that only exist on basically just college campuses and not really in real life. These things that that conservatives get really, really verklempt about. And,
to use a word that was popularized on SNL.
Was it?
Yeah, what was it? The Mike Myers when he's playing this, what was it? Upper West Side talk show host, Coffee Talk with Linda Richmond.
Right. Yeah, she just uses all sorts of like Americanized Yiddish.
Yeah,
right?
Yiddishisms and like fake Yiddishisms.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I mean, even that, like, okay. The fact that you used that word, I think indicates the cultural power of this show, because that was a skit from like 30 years ago, and people are still saying verklempt, which I think is a real Yiddish word, but like, I
think it is.
Was not one of the probably not one of the ones heard in Jewish households in the the 80s or 90s. Okay. Let's. Do you have anything else on SNL before we got to move back to the cancel stuff?
No, I don't like talking about SNL.
Okay, so no more SNL. So, where should we take this? So, I think you mentioned comedy, and a lot of this seems to revolve around comedians. Yeah. And Osita's piece is primarily about comedy, and starts off with a recitation of the history of Lenny Bruce. As an example of someone who really kind of was canceled by the powers that be and kind of driven to his death by his repeated harassment by the authorities who would arrest him for indecency and things like that. And there were some parts of the history that I, despite being kind of a comedy fan or nerd, never knew about. And then he kind of shifts to the current day and says, okay, who has really been canceled here? Comparable to Lenny Bruce, driven to overdose at the age of 39. And yeah, no one has hit those. No one has gone. That hasn't happened yet. I mean, it is kind of interesting that in a dark, twisted way that there hasn't, with the possible exception of Jeffrey Epstein, there hasn't been a prominent person who was canceled or Me Too'd or something who died. Either through suicide or an overdose. Right. Shortly thereafter.
And that's kind of the thing that's at the center of all of this, right? Me Too is a form of whatever this blob is that, comes out as cancel culture, or even more mildly as call out culture. And what I thought was really interesting about Osita's piece specifically is that he opens with the Lenny Bruce thing, to bring up how like this whole thing is about how power can be flexed over somebody's material life to ruin it and kill them. And how like that's sort of not happening at all right now in any other way. And this is like a little bit of an issue that I have with the Me Too movement as a whole, that like in the case of everybody except for Harvey Weinstein, like, and even then he's still just extremely rich. He's just not going to make movies anymore. And he has to go to court and hopefully he'll sit in jail, but he'll go to fancy people jail and then he'll get out and still be rich. It doesn't there, like, there's not a mechanism by which any of this like public support for rejecting a human being can actually have the material ramifications that the U.S. government had on Lenny Bruce, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of like the brunt of his argument, and I really agree with that. I don't think that he really makes it as directly clear as like there's not a mechanism of power by which calling out and canceling is going to have enormous material ramifications on anyone. And especially if it's, you know, powerful and famous people. Like, I kind of want to shy away from talking about comedians a little bit in the context of this. Like, I know that it's the center of Asita's article, which is, you know, it was good. Like, go read it. But like, you know, there are other realms in which this happens, like specifically in terms of Me Too, and also like when you talk about like cancellation in terms of comedians get mad, and there's like this whole separate sublevel of actually within like comedy culture that they understand what their work environment's like. They have a better grasp on like what the reality of these events actually are for comedians, and so like they talk it out and have been arguing for forever about it. It feels like at this point, but. Yeah, like Asita, he brings in Lenny Bruce, and that's a really good, like, this is the way that you can actually have your life ruined because of your career. And somewhere in the middle of the article, he starts talking about columnists and journalists who have been writing about cancellation culture and how they'll sometimes just go through lists, or how people like David Brooks will be like, this is like Nazi Germany. And the reason that it's not is because there's not a power structure condemning these people. It's just it's an agreement among a bunch of different people coming together and trying to make their voices loud as a collective, right? It's not a top-down like condemnation from a mechanism like the United States government or like the Motion Picture Association, right? Like, these people aren't being blacklisted in any way that's like McCarthyism, even though that constantly gets like compared. Because like Louis C.K., he was gone for a year and a half, and now he's back and he's doing comedy again without really issuing an apology. Aziz Ansari, like, you know, he was canceled for like a while ago, it feels like, but it feels like he never actually really left. He was just sorry in public.
I think he took some sort of break, but, you know, it's not like a touring comedian is always touring. Like, they take time off to, you know, write new material or something. So yeah, he came back. He has a Netflix special. I mean, I think I don't want to focus on comedy exclusively, but I think what's interesting about comedy is, I mean, one, you have the idea that the comedian is supposed to be like the provocateur and the truth teller. And, you know, that goes way back to like the medieval jester or something. And then you also have, you know, well, you don't have a boss because you're a freelancer. Well, almost very few comedians have bosses unless they're, you know, they're working, writing for a sitcom or, you know, acting in a sitcom or something. They're kind of free agents, and then they have to deal with all, you know, like, you know, all these individual like small power centers around the country if they want to tour, and then they have to deal with, you know, like institutions like Netflix or HBO if they want a comedy special. And so, yeah, I mean, people who want to like participate in cancel culture, and there's plenty of them. They want to get people fired. And that's become the thing, is like, we're going to get you fired. And it's hard to fire a comedian because they are self-employed, basically. It's somewhat easier to fire other people, but, you know, I mean, a lot of people who when you're famous and prominent, you probably don't have a boss. Like Kevin Spacey doesn't have a boss. He's pretty much been drummed out of, like, he probably will not act again in any sort of major Hollywood feature, but maybe he'll like work overseas or something, or do independent something or other, or self-produce something.
Right.
But whether or not he ever gets convicted of any sexual crimes, like his career is basically over, even though he like doesn't, he can't be fired. But but CK can just find a venue and a booking agent or whatever, and people will come because he's famous and he is talented and funny. Just a side note, one of the things I really didn't like about how all this played out the past couple of years is when like someone would get Me Too'd or canceled, and then people would be like, I never liked them to begin with. They're like, they fucking suck.
Right.
A fucking hack. Get the fuck out of here. We don't care about you. Like, no, Louis C.K. is incredibly talented, like one of the most talented comedians of all time. He also
For his time and place, he was really funny.
Yeah, he's also like
I laughed at him.
a pervert and possibly guilty of sexual assault. It's a weird gray area, but it seems more likely than not. But he'd never actually be convicted in court. But yeah, so the people on Sorry is talented. He will continue to work. And I guess it was a hiccup, in their careers, but they'll basically be just fine, I think. So yes, that's part of it, is that some people are hard to cancel. And then the other thing is, going back to the anecdote you told at the beginning, you stirred up some shit on Twitter and then someone unleashed their followers upon you, but it's from like a different part of Twitter than yours. And It's this idea that is actually very obvious, but I only read it in the past couple of weeks, and it makes so much sense. You can only be canceled by your own side. All those people couldn't cancel you, and left Twitter can't cancel Bret Stephens. And,
right.
But maybe like neocon Twitter could cancel Bret Stephens if they decided to. Maybe.
I don't think that neocon Twitter has any interest in like performing cancellation. I mean, like they do in their own right, and this is very interesting. But like the language that we're using it's specific to a certain subsect of society, right? Like how much of this actually exists in other places. And this is the interesting, like I think about this a lot. When people on the right and conservatives and people who are like enthusiastic capitalists get mad at cancel culture, really what that is just like a market aggressively trying to reject a product, right? Mm-hmm. And like it's the market sort of working itself out in terms of it being the consumer base, or like a certain number of consumers who don't want that thing to exist any longer within the market. And so this is the like Hayek invisible hand of the market, or whatever, whoever said it, like thing that they should hypothetically actually love, but they don't. I guess the market is also supposed to be like silent, right? It's not supposed to make a big hubbub about like, and it's supposed to be about creamed corn. It's not supposed to be about individual people's careers.
Right. Well, I guess what the conservatives say is like, okay, you could, it's the elites who are trying to cancel someone where the masses are still with them. So Louis C.K. can still fill a concert venue or whatever. But like the effete, liberals on the coast don't want him there. So they're trying to prevent the solid, hardworking Americans from getting access to Louis C.K.
Right, but that's just, that's this sort of denial mechanism that they have for they've been saying this for decades, like the silent majority nonsense, or the moral majority, like all of these people who don't really have a voice because they're silenced by the coastal elite liberals, and that's not real. This is just something that conservatives hold on to every day so that they can fall asleep and rest assured that one day they will have cultural capital. It's just not real. Uh-huh. And especially not with this call out culture and cancellation and Me Too, is that it's from a public, a large group of individuals that aren't necessarily elite that are making this argument louder than people in power would like it to be. And so they basically just have it backwards that it's people in power that are like sort of guiding these things when it's really not. It's mostly it's the idea of power that really is like the driver and the motivator behind all of this stuff. But it's not people who actually have power that are doing it, which is the reason that it's so outrageous to most people. Like when people get really scared or head up about Me Too or cancel culture, whatever, it's because it's not divined by like, you know, people who have offices in corner rooms at the tops of buildings in New York City, right? This is people who are speaking, who are able to gather enthusiasm for their point of view because they share grievances with other people, and they, you know, they're trying to use their voice as a public to affect like entertainment, and it's mostly entertainment. It's not really anywhere else. I mean, sometimes it's politicians, but not really, you know? But yeah, I hope that's not too rambly. I wanted it to make sense.
Yeah, I think there's just, I don't know. Well, what I was thinking is like, okay, so, you know, Bret Stephens has had this whole saga about his social media. We did an episode of Blogging Heads with Daniel Bessner, Eli Lake debating it, but you know, he's like stormed off Twitter in a huff and said like, I'll never be on here again more than once.
Right.
But maybe it's made such a, like, it would be pretty pathetic for him to come back at this point. He made such a huge deal about leaving.
I've done this too. This is the most relatable thing that Bret Stephens has ever done.
So you said, screw you guys, I'm going home.
Like,
It's the irresistible lore of Twitter. Okay, but okay, in some way, like, we could say that the people who yell at Bret Stephens on Twitter drove him off Twitter in some way. But he still has his job, and for some reason, New York Times op-ed columnist is lifetime tenure, and so he'll be there another 50 years. We wish him good health. And the only person who can cancel him is his boss, you know, James Bennett, or like A.G. Sulzberger Jr., or whatever his name is. So Bret Stephens will be fine. But Bret Stephens, you know, when he was working like 15 years ago at the Wall Street Journal or wherever, he didn't have to hear from the rabble on Twitter. He got maybe letters to the editor and weird emails, but he didn't get the kind of people like saying like, Bret Stephens, fuck you, you fucking suck, that, you know, he would be getting on Twitter all the time. And I, you know, pretty much if you're a prominent person in any respect, you're probably getting some level of people saying like, fuck you, go kill yourself, I'm going to murder you, which is just the insanity of our current era and the technology. So I guess, I mean, part of it is like, is cancel culture just because of Twitter? And the media elite has made Twitter, you know, their home, and so they have to be on there. But then you also have the rabble and the hoi polloi who are on there making fun of these people, and also the crazy people who are saying, you know, I want to put you in a gas chamber. So is it just the invention of social media that has, you know, people were always angry at, you know, columns in the newspaper, but you had to type out a letter to the editor if you wanted to make a big deal out of it, and that was, you know, that took a lot of time. And I mean, whereas now it's super easy to say, fuck you, Bret Stephens.
I have a little bit of a unique perspective on this because, like, my dad was a columnist for, like, a long time at a somewhat prominent newspaper. And, like, he had opinions that a lot of people really didn't like. And he, you know, before Twitter, the thing that columnists would do is, it's not just letters to the editor where you'd have to like type up a letter and print it out and send it. You could also send emails, but also like columnists very frequently put out their phone numbers. Mm-hmm. And so my dad would get calls, and like he just had mailboxes full of people screaming just like horrible things at him. And usually he would always, like, this is the funny thing about Bret Stephens, I think, is that like Bret Stephens has to like cry, right? He has to cry in public. He has to be like, he has to sort of like martyr himself in front of everyone. Like, I'm just merely saying my wonderful, very hard thought opinions out loud, and you people are telling me to die and fuck myself, etc. And like, and like he has to sort of like lambast himself like in public so that people feel bad for him, and he signs off when it's very clear that fewer people than he wants are feeling bad for him, right? And like, I mean, I've never actually talked about this with my dad, but like my dad would keep these these voicemails and these emails mostly to himself. I would find them because I was a curious kid, but like, and they were horrible. Like, they threatened to murder his family, like, but every once in a while he'd have
threatening to murder you.
Yeah, me. Stuff like that. But he would keep it to himself, and sometimes he would engage with these people. Like, he'd write them letters back being like, well, here's why you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong, and here's why you're wrong. And that was his favorite part about it. Okay. He enjoyed this aspect of his job, like, immensely. And so I think that Bret Stephens is just a whiny brat. Because kind of being a columnist means a public figure in a capacity where you say things, and you're getting paid to have thoughts that most people aren't organically having, right? You're in a state of sort of perpetual cancellation from a certain demographic of people, and it's part of your job. At least I think that this might be what my dad would say, but it's certainly what I think. If you have this job, it's part of your job to deal with it. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so like, I don't know, it was, when I was observing this when I was younger, you know, it was obviously before cancellation was even a term, but I think that it's really interesting that like the way to deal with it is just to not deal with it in public. Especially for somebody like Bret Stephens.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, him sending the email to the guy and CCing the provost or whatever. It's a very stupid move for Mr. Stephens.
And then he wrote another column being like, poor me, I was compared to a bug.
Yeah, and that column was a misstep as well. And yeah, he was like, I mean, what he was essentially saying was like, you are doing a Holocaust to me. Like, almost literally, right. That's what he was saying, which is pretty insane. We're just talking about people like yelling and calling names on Twitter, which is, you know, a lot of what happens on Twitter.
But that's like David Brooks also does this. Like people love claiming that there are Holocausts happening to them all the time, especially if they're in positions of power where like they're not going to see any real monetary or like social ramifications to their position.
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't know, I've been thinking for a long time that like something changed at some point in American history. I feel like where it used to be like you wanted to be like the victor, and now you like want to be the victim. And you know, Donald Trump often says people are being very unfair to me.
Right.
And like if only the fake news and the lying New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like. You know, that kind of petulant, like, I could have won, but you didn't play fair, and that kind of thing. Like, everyone just sees himself as the victim. Some are legitimate victims. Bret Stephens, op-ed columnist for life for the New York Times, not a victim. But everyone just, like, kind of glories in victimhood. And it's kind of weird for our, like, culture of, you know, manly conquering the West and that kind of thing. But
well, it's because it came like it's this sort of weird mutation of an already false narrative that we had about like American society as a whole, which was that we were, you know, this pathetic tiny little nation that beat up its dad and got its own apartment at age 17 and you know, like, didn't have any money to go to college, and so we worked our way up in the corporation of the world. And, like, the idea that America has always been this underdog, right? This, like, small, it's David and Goliath, us against literally anyone, including we had, like, you know, something like that underdog narrative in Vietnam. Like, it was clearly false in Korea, so, like, nobody ever even talked about Korea, and we still don't. And then, like, World War II, we were the underdog against the giant machine of the Nazis, right? And also, like, the Cold War, like, the USSR was this incredible machine, the likes of which no one had ever seen before. And, you know, what was poor little capitalism supposed to do in this quiet war of ideology? And so this idea that, like, that it's something that individuals are able to very easily adopt. And you see this with like bootstraps, like this idea that you had to work your way up from nothing in order to have value. And that you consistently work the Protestant work ethic also within American ideas. And like now, And I think that it's partially because we're caught up in this constant and unrelenting dialogue via social media that things sort of get boiled down to their most base notions. And, like, what it really comes down to is the underdog sometimes loses, right? Mm-hmm. And even though they're much more noble and they're secretly more powerful, the other side didn't play fair. And so it's very easy to turn this noble underdog idea into this, like, pathetic victim of unfair circumstance and not have too much of a cognitive dissonance about them being particularly different.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you spoke to, like, Trump supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters and asked them who was more unfavorably treated by the mainstream media in 2016, you know, they would each think that they were more unfairly treated by the media.
Right.
So, I think that's it. Yeah, that makes a kind of sense. So I want to talk about who has actually been canceled, if anyone. So you, in your initial anecdote, you're talking about getting on the plane. So that's reminiscent of the famous story of Justine Sacco, who was this woman who tweeted an offensive joke and then got on a plane ride to Africa. And this was this was like 2010 or so, early days of Twitter. And I think it was Sam Biddle, some tech columnist for like Gizmodo or something, retweeted her off-color, offensive joke, which was clearly meant in jest, not seriously, about AIDS in Africa. And by the time her plane had landed, she had been fired from her job in public relations, which is, she should have known better. But her life was certainly upended. There's a book by John Ronson called "So You've Been Publicly Shamed" that came out kind of before, I guess, the cancel culture terminology came into being. And her life was fucked up. This does happen. I think, the times when it's just a random person who is somehow swept up in a social media storm, so they have less power, they have less money, less ability to craft a counter narrative or something. So this guy who seemed mentally ill to me, who was in a bagel place in Long Island, who was
the Bagel Boss,
who was yelling at people about how women on dating sites didn't like him because he was too short. And this clip went viral because it was just so strange. And in the end, someone punches the guy out. To me, this guy was clearly just mentally ill. And yet there was this, kind of like celebration of dunking on this small man who was having a breakdown in a bagel store. And did he get canceled? He ended up being on that stupid website Cameo, where you can pay someone $25 to wish your cousin happy birthday in a video clip.
Yeah, he's making money off of it. And,
so I guess that's kind of the new American dream. But that doesn't always happen to everyone. These things, like the viral, the person having the worst day of their life that happens to be captured on video and then it becomes a viral video story. I think that's not good, and that's different than ragging on a prominent comedian or writer or journalist or something.
I don't know. Do you remember that lady, this white lady, who got on the phone and called the cops because a 7-year-old black girl was selling water bottles?
Yes, I do remember.
And she was like, "You don't have a permit for this," which is ridiculous. And people investigated this person and her whole life. And in situations like that, I think the core of this conversation that we're having, in situations like that, do people need to learn punitive lessons? And I think that in that specific situation where somebody was literally just exercising their privilege over a child, is one in which, maybe this lady should lose her dogweed business for a few months, right? Because that's what her job was.
Right, she did. I mean, I don't, unless the person is doing something very bad, then I don't like this this trend in modern life. We only a word, I don't know if you were looking at Twitter today, a word that was trending was Covington, because it was a weird trending topic, because people were, conservatives are mad at the young woman, Greta, wasn't her last name Thunberg, who is the climate, leading this climate movement. And so they're yelling at a teenager. And then people on the left are saying, how dare you yell at a teenage girl like that? And then people on the right are saying, don't you remember what happened to Mr. Covington and blah, blah, blah. And so, and the Covington debacle was such a waste of like a week of everyone's mental energy, because
was that those like the just shitty kids?
The teenagers in Washington were wearing the MAGA hats.
Yeah,
a totally stupid story.
Should not have been a Native American man with a drum. Yeah,
should not have been even a local news story. It was just that there was a video that was edited in a way to rouse people's passions. And so I just feel like a lot of this is a regrettable fact of modern life, that everyone has a camera on them at all times and they can upload anything to YouTube at any time and edit it selectively if they want to, or sometimes even the raw footage doesn't really show what's truly happening. And then why certain things come to the attention of political reporters and such, and they elevate it to the Washington Post. I guess that one was happening at a anti-abortion rally in Washington, D.C. That was part of it. But it was like, this is not, no one even, I said this before on my show, no one even got punched in that exchange. It was people looking at each other. So like, if someone punched someone else, that's not a national news story. So people just looking at each other, that's definitely not a national news story. And there's a lot of events like this. I don't know. I mean, there's such a, social media, Twitter especially, promotes such a bandwagon, us versus them kind of thing. And people just enjoy joining in and hating on their enemy, even if they didn't know who this person was, 5 minutes before.
Right. And a lot of the time it is people just trying to exercise some simulacrum of power in their otherwise powerless lives. Because there isn't, and this is my problem with Me Too and with all of the rest of the stuff. And this question specifically is how many people have really been canceled? How many people really have, had damage to their personal lives done? And the answer is not many. And it's because what this whole phenomenon is just, groups of people with very limited power coming together and trying to exercise some of it in situations where they want to see more justice actually being done. And the problem with canceling and with Me Too specifically is that there's not a mechanism by which you can actually obtain any sort of real justice in any of these situations. And you're not going to get justice from yelling at people online. You're not really going to get justice from getting people fired. That's just the closest thing to any sort of leverage that you have over these people's lives. And it's the people who have less power that end up being the most impacted by this.
So the Bagel Boss guy, I didn't look super closely into this story, but I did watch the video multiple times because it was on Twitter constantly. If this, I think I'm in the minority by thinking that this guy was clearly mentally ill, but, so
I don't agree with you. Yeah.
Okay. So does he, is this a man who could hold down a job anyway? He probably got fired from the job. If that happened and maybe he's on disability or something, if he can't hold down a job, so the only lever is the capitalist lever of kicking him out of the system. And it's kind of funny if you think the ideal world that a lot of the Twitter leftists envision, it wouldn't matter if you get fired from your job because you would you would maintain healthcare and you would probably be given some kind of monetary stipend or job training to move to some other collectively owned enterprise. So what is what's the punishment for Bagel Boss guy and all these other minor malefactors?
Well, I mean that is that's a broader question because then you get into the idea of what actually in a leftist society would crime actually look like. What's the gradient between personal offense and crime? And then also what any sort of punitive system would actually look like, because and this sort of thing where it's like, you know, expressing dissident opinions or something like that, or also just being a racist, like, which like does deserve something corrective happening to it, like, and that is all sort of included in this larger idea of like what a leftist justice system would actually look like.
Okay, yeah, so that's probably too big of a topic to shoehorn in here. So
I'm not doing it.
Let's move away from that one. Did you? Okay, well, let me run this one by you, and then maybe one more topic after that. So, in a previous episode of the show with Phoebe Maltzbovy, I put forward my personal theory that there's no cancellation but self-cancellation, which I think maybe aligns with what you're thinking. Like, you know, so there's these stories about, young adult novelists who had their manuscripts questioned by like people who thought they were offensive, and then the authors themselves withdrew from publication of their books. This is mentioned in Osita's article, and actually Kat Rosenfield, who wrote about this, was saying on Twitter that her writing had been mischaracterized. So let's note that. But the people who don't withdraw their novels, like let's say there's like a conservative young adult novelist, and he includes something that's a little offensive, and then a storm is kicked up, but he doesn't care about pissing off, you know, the people from racial minorities who might possibly be offended. So he goes ahead with publication, and then he makes money. Meanwhile, the person who like inadvertently perhaps included some racial stereotypes in their young adult novel, they withdraw it, and so they lose out on publicity and making money and so forth. So in most cases, like, if people just keep their heads down, they kind of like ride it out, like Ansari and CK seem to have been able to do.
Yeah.
And in other cases, like, if you don't resign or, you know, withdraw, you know, say we're not going to release our movie anymore or something along those lines, like the attention just moves on to some other thing because it's always a new outrage, and usually you'll just be fine. So that would be my general advice for anyone who is in the targets of being canceled, is just, you know, stay strong and you'll probably be fine.
Right. And, I mean, like, it's not to say that some instances of cancellation aren't justified. It's just like, if you're an intelligent human being, you don't engage with this, right? The idea is to, like, mostly the thing that people want to achieve is just to never hear about you again. Like, you know, when people on the internet were yelling at me, I locked while I was on an airplane because I was like, it's going to be an hour and 20 minutes. People are going to be real mad at me. So I locked up for a minute, and people were sharing a screenshot of my page being locked and sending it to the person who I had just harmed. And we're like, well, look, I hope this makes you feel better. Look, she's no longer a public account. Like, which was, that's the thing that they wanted. They wanted me to go away. And so when I came back, it just got worse. The idea is, yeah, like, basically if you just write it out for long enough, people are going to forget and not care about you.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the problem with, like, you know, every time a comedian gets called out for this, or anytime somebody who's like online gets called out for things, they have to engage with it because, you know, a lot of their personality is just saying things out loud. Mm-hmm. But if you just log off for a little bit, you can come back later. It's fine.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And, you know, I think, you know, there's this whole thing, I don't know if it happens on right Twitter, definitely happens on left Twitter. You're trolling someone, they block you, you post the screenshots, you've won. Like, you got
right
to them, you forced them to do something and, like, admit that they couldn't stand your trolling anymore. So
right.
When you locked your account, there were probably some people who were like, we did it, like, she can't, you know, spout her nonsense all over the internet anymore. And then you unlock 4 hours later. Yeah, maybe someone else has had a meltdown in a bagel shop in Long Island, and...
Yeah, I mean, it didn't actually happen that way. They continued to, like, yeah, they wanted the cancel button to work better. And so they were, like, calling the Genius Bar, trying to troubleshoot it. Like, just, honestly, like, I ended up having people in my mentions for just hours. It was very odd. I blocked a whole lot of people. Mm-hmm. And then it was sort of like at the end when I thought everything was over, that Ragnarok lobster guy showed up.
Oh, man.
Yeah, he started yelling at me too, and I was like, okay, so this means that it's over, right? Like, this guy, they're clearly no longer sending their best.
Wait, so were these like pro like Clinton people or something who were going after?
Yeah, it was like liberal Twitter. Basically, like what happened was this lady who has been extremely racist in the past, but she's, you know, she says that she's getting a PhD in history of law or something. She did a post about how Bernie Sanders' tweet that Brett Kavanaugh should never be a judge wasn't enough. That he needed to mention Brett Kavanaugh's victims in his initial tweet and not later in the thread. That he was, you know, women don't matter or whatever. And as you know, I also went through a sexual assault that was pretty similar to Christine Blasey Ford. And at the time that this whole hearing was happening, I was working at Planned Parenthood. And so I had to engage with this whole thing directly, this national conversation that we were having, like as part of my job. And so like, it's kind of a sensitive subject for me. And what it seemed that this person was doing to me was that they were utilizing the sexual assault of other people as leverage to condemn somebody else. And for me, personally, I don't think that other people's sexual assault exists so that other people can identify with it. But that's clearly like what this person was doing, like centering themselves in this conversation in order to gain political points against Bernie Sanders. Mm-hmm. And so I called that out, and they all got mad at me because this person speaks up against sexual assault. That's the thing that they yelled at me a lot.
And did this person like direct her followers to you, or just like retweet, or how did they push you on blast?
There was a lot of like, this person used terrible language against me, a sexual assault survivor. And then in my mentions, I got a couple of like 20,000 follower accounts being like, your tweet is abuse. And I was like, that's really not true. That's not what that means. Please stop using like this type of language against me. But they wanted to tell me that I was, you know, gaslighting them. I was a harasser. I was an abuser. And then it sort of, as I just refused to log off longer and longer, it ramped up to, your sexual assault didn't even happen. I got quote tweeted with, this person just made up this experience that happened to them because they want to defend their bad tweet. Like, you know, denial of my actual personal experience. Mm-hmm. And that was the thing that where, like, for maybe an hour, I was like, this is really bad. Like, this is horrifying. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, Ragnarok Lobster had to post and say, like, oh, you're a gaslighter. And I was like, I'm sorry. I got way too in my head about this. This is all just complete and utter nonsense. I'm just going to mute this thread and move along with the rest of my life.
Yeah. I think, so yeah, sorry you underwent partial cancellation or attempted cancellation or whatever. That sounds miserable. I think, you know, there's, I don't know, should there be a difference between being canceled for something you did or versus something you said or wrote? You know, the Me Too stuff is almost entirely men taking actions that are abusive or assault or, you know, criminal or all the above, versus so, you know, a tweet that is bad. You know, what is the I guess there's this kind of idea in some parts of like the social justice left that you know, like words can be violence and stuff. That seems dubious to me. But, you know, how much do you care about just what some person said, especially when it's just a random person out there on the internet? You know, we're not thinking about Donald Trump and all the crazy things he says every day. It's just like someone said something. Like, does this matter? You know, that's where I usually think no. It doesn't really, you know, just let them go on with their stupidity. Like, we don't need to call them out and make their afternoon miserable or something. But
maybe, I mean, it's fun for people who do it. It's fun. Like, that's part of the motivation behind it, is that, like, it's really, really fun to fancy yourself being in a correct position over somebody else, right? It's entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, moral righteousness and like zeal and feeling like you're fighting for the like cause of goodness in the universe feels
right.
Good. Yeah. Well, did you maybe this we're almost at an hour, so maybe this is the last thing. Did you see the Michelle Goldberg column from last week? Roy Cohn is how we got Trump.
No.
Well, the link will be below. So Michelle Goldberg, also at the New York Times op-ed page, the only op-ed page that matters, seemingly. And so she wrote a piece about Roy Cohn because there's a documentary about Cohn that just came out. And, you know, Cohn was, worked with McCarthy, to go after supposed communists. And then, he eventually was a private lawyer in New York and, was kind of a counselor to, Donald Trump in the 80s, but was leading a double life as a gay man, and he died of AIDS, but never admitted that he was gay or that he had AIDS. But Goldberg writes about how, you know, Cohn or Cohn, I'm not exactly sure. My last name is Cohen, so we'll say Cohn. He was basically an evil person his entire life, but he was kind of somewhere between like tolerated and celebrated by the elite in New York City after he, you know, left government, because he was this kind of like bad dude who would like, you know, say outrageous things and was connected to the mob. Like, you know, he was kind of a mob lawyer, and you know, he had this like past where he had done shady tricks and kind of things. And so he was like, you know, Andy Warhol had him at his parties, and people like, you know, kind of celebrated him as this curiosity who would hang around, and you know, they tolerated his evil essentially. And she says, you know, where was the, you know, maybe we need some cancel culture to replace this culture of, you know, thinking that like if you're bad, that means you're cool, and we should accept you, instead of like, oh, you did a lot of bad shit in your past, like, you know, I don't want to invite you to my dinner party anymore. So she says that's the attitude that prevailed in New York City during the 70s and 80s, when a certain young real estate developer named Donald Trump also played a similar game of being the sort of clownish, outrageous bad boy who people tolerated because he was good for a laugh, and yeah, etc.
Well, I think I mean, like, you know how people are constantly just punching at different things, trying to hit the thing that actually gave us Donald Trump. This kind of sounds like another one of those things. Mm-hmm. When like really like cancel culture isn't going to solve the idea that we reward vile people for their vile behavior. The reason that they get rewarded is, I mean, it's not so much while the reward is often like it manifests itself socially, it's mostly monetary. And like we reward people for having money regardless of how they got it. Mm-hmm. And so like cancel culture is not going to get rid of people in powerful situations unless you overhaul the system that rewards that to begin with, right? Like there's not, unless you actually are able to actually confront power, then there's no way that you're going to stop rewarding these bad people for having success for doing bad things. Like I can't remember, there was an article like last week and I can't remember what it was. I wish I could. But it was basically about the idea that even though the average American is told throughout their life that if they work hard, they can achieve like whatever, like we're just given Protestant work ethic constantly. Mm-hmm. We've watched like Jerry Falwell types and also like Amway and pyramid schemes and all of these things that are short, quick ways to get money, ending up creating like gigantic networks of billionaires that extract money from the most poor people in the country. And then you get like Eric Prince's and Betsy DeVos's out of that sort of system, and Jerry Falwell Jr.'s. And the reality is that even though we're told out loud that, you know, being ethical and moral and working very hard is the thing that's going to get us success, the thing that the thing that is demonstrated to us that will make you successful is being a scam artist. Mm-hmm. And not actually caring about other people. but pretending to in such a way where like you become successful through that. So yeah, like we got Trump because we reward scamming people. And, you know, I don't think that canceling Aryeh Cohen or canceling the things that make these people rich and famous is going to actually have the result that we want. It's going to require something bigger and a social change with greater magnitude. If we actually want to do that, which choose to say that we would as a society, you know?
Yeah, and there's definitely, you know, there's, as been noted, there's like an increased cultural appetite for stories about scammers over the past couple of years. Our president is a scammer.
Right.
And, you know,
we love this.
Yeah, well, there's something, I mean, there's, like, there were two documentaries about the Fire Festival, and I watched both of them. Like, there's something delicious in a scam, and then there's something delicious in the scam being, you know, falling apart. And I guess
you know what the article...
The successful
Sorry.
scams you, I guess, often don't hear about because they ride off into the sunset or something.
Yeah. I remembered what it was. I listened to Gia Tolentino's audiobook, Trick Mirror, that just came out. Personally, I think it's great.
I have a copy of the book.
Yeah, and that's what I was thinking of, is I listened to it last week, and she hasn't, that, because she was in the Fire Festival documentary.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you get, I mean, just, you know, I can think of right off the top of my head 3 different podcasts about scams or multi-level marketing that I've listened to in the past year. I don't know if it's an American thing or just a human thing. Something about like the tricksters or something we're attracted to. I think that's all the things I wanted to talk about. Do you have anything else you want to mention before we close out?
Not really. I'm on a podcast, another one.
Okay.
It's about the Brian Jakes books for children, Redwall. And it's called the Redwall Pod. And if anybody wants to listen to it, I've got cool recipes.
Is that it's like mice?
Yeah, it's about little animals that live in an abbey, and they're constantly, like, fighting against the evils of the world that usually manifest as rats and weasels. And so we just talk about those books because the panel has, like, a lot of memories growing up and reading them.
Okay.
And I think the food is cool, so...
I think I did not read that as a kid, but was vaguely aware of it.
Well...
But we'll include the link to that. And what's the name of that one again?
It's called the Red Wall. The Red Wall.
The Red Wall, okay.
Yeah.
And as you said, you're on Twitter as Epona West.
Yeah, I'm the ghost wife.
And you are the ghost wife. I am on Twitter as Aryeh Cohen-Wade. ARYHCW is the handle. So thank you so much for coming on talking cancel culture. I'm glad you did not actually get canceled, at least before you were able to make this appearance.
That's right.
Hopefully the people in the comments will not cancel us either. Okay.
Yeah,
so.
I didn't say, listen, I'm not canceling anybody, and I'm not canceling anybody. I'm in a constant state of non-cancellation. Like, I'm Schrodinger's cancel right now.
Yeah.
I didn't open the box, man. Don't yell at me.
A superposition. Yeah, that's interesting. It's like we're all somewhere in between, and then eventually you find out, and you're like, oh man, canceled all along. Okay, so thank you, Mellie. Thank you to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
All right, bye.